Good morning, welcome to LAMFcast, and thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Scott Likens. I'm the Artistic and Executive Director of the Lakeshore Music Festival, and our LAMFcast series is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Today's LAMFcast session is titled Appropriate Celebration, and it is paralleling the concert that we're performing on August 18th called Watermark. And that concert is sponsored in part by Deerwood Bank, the Center for Organizational Development, and John Sullivan. With all that said, I'm going to turn over the session to Garrett McQueen, our artistic advisor, who will be guiding us through this today. And just a reminder, if you're tuning in on Zoom, you can put any questions that come up while he is going through the presentation in the Q&A function, or if you're joining us on Facebook, put those in the comments and he'll get to those eventually. So good morning, Garrett. Thanks for being here and have fun.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. And good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's LAMFcast. Again, as Scott mentioned, this presentation is in conjunction with the August 18th concert titled Watermark. Before I get into the presentation, I just want to take my hat off to and congratulate Scott for such an interesting and dynamic program. This program has music and aesthetics that span centuries, and it really offers up some really great conversations, some really great things to think about as you listen to the concert, some things that I'll be bringing up in the presentation today. So I'm personally really looking forward to this August 18th concert. The piano soloist Tanya Gabrielian is a woman who I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, both musically and in the production of content and media. So thanks everyone for being here this morning. Really excited about this concert and excited to share this presentation with you today. So I named this presentation for this week, Celebration versus Appropriation. What we're going to do is that we're going to go through the program, look at each of the pieces, look at each of the composers, and take a comparative look at what they were writing and decide whether or not we're hearing celebration or appropriation. Again, a really great conversation to engage in conjunction with this concert, and some really interesting factoids along the way. Some of the things we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about the Hofner family, specifically Sigmund Hofner. So a little bit more about them and who they were, Mozart's connection to the Hofner family, how they were initially connected, how they were connected all the way from birth even, and how that resulted in some really great music. We'll talk about Mozart's connection to Haydn in conjunction to a piece of music by Prokofiev that's on this concert. Prokofiev's appreciation of not only Haydn, but also Mozart and the entire aesthetic that we've now deemed the classical era of Western classical music. We'll look at a couple similarities between Prokofiev and Steve Reich. We'll go into Reich's appropriation of African aesthetics and how he dealt with that later on, how he responded to the critiques. We'll do the same thing with Caroline Shaw, her appropriation of an indigenous aesthetic and how she responded to that. And we'll wrap up by talking a little bit about Caroline Shaw's Watermark and how it relates to a much earlier composition written by the one and only Ludwig van Beethoven. So to get us started, we have Sigmund Hofner and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. So Sigmund Hofner, born in 1776, the same year as Mozart, about 8 months later, was born to a very noble family. They had lots of money. They were very influential throughout the community, and they were lovers of music. They always made sure that, especially Sigmund Hofner, once he grew up, always made sure that grand occasions occasions and anything important, anything of note was accompanied by a bit of new music, original music. So with Mozart on the scene there in Salzburg in the late 1700s, he was often someone who folks came to. It's important to note and to remember that Mozart himself was not a nobleman, not a noble person, but he had those really, really great connections that always got him into the right room at the right time, especially when it comes, to the Hofners. Mozart would, over his career, as everyone knows throughout the world, would continue to earn a reputation as this master genius, prodigy musician. And this not only caught the attention of the Hofners, it actually worked the other way around. Mozart writing music for the Hofners put their name more on the global stage as well. So the help and the assistance they gave in growing each other's reputation definitely went both ways. They were initially connected, Sigmund Hofner and Mozart, for the occasion of the wedding of Sigmund Hofner's sister. When they were making all of the plans for this grand occasion, Sigmund Hofner reached out to Mozart and asked him to write a piece of music for the occasion. This resulted in a piece of music known as the Hofner Serenade. Now, this isn't the piece of music that is going to be on the August 18th concert, but it's very important to note because this helped solidify the relationship between the Hofner family and Mozart. They were so pleased, so happy with the piece of music that was written for the Hofner wedding that they continued to get Mozart to write different things, with this piece of music being the groundwork for that. The Hofner Serenade, again, not to be confused with Mozart's 35th Symphony, the Hofner Symphony. The Hofner Serenade was written and premiered in the year of 1776. When I think about the legacy of Mozart, particularly when it comes to the late 1700s, I can't help but to think about the rest of the world. So when you think about the premiere of this Hofner Serenade, you also have to think about the codification of what we now call the United States, everything that was going on in this part of the world. While Mozart was, writing music and gaining a reputation. I feel like it's easy for us to separate those two times in history, but even if just as an aside, I think it's important to think about that as we think about, the global world and how music played a role in it. This Hofner Serenade has gone through many evolutions over the years. These days, you'll hear much of it arranged for solo violin and orchestra and small orchestra, much like the Steve Reich piece that is coming up later in this program. So I thought we would listen to a little bit of the Hofner Serenade, just so that you could get an idea of the sounds that the Hofner family fell in love with, and that would eventually just solidify the relationship between the noble Hofner family and Mozart. So this is a selection from the Hofner Serenade from the Rondo. This performance features Camerata Florianopoulos, and the solo violinist here, we'll listen to about a minute, is Eva Nunez Giracha. Yeah, I can't help but to smile just listening to that. I think it really, excuse me, showcases that bright, cheerful, even youthful, ever youthful Mozart sound that we've all grown to love over the centuries. So if that is, the continued reaction to that piece of music, imagine what the reaction must have been when it was a new composition. Everyone in the court, the Hofner family loved it. And that is why, in part, the relationship between the Hofners and Mozart continued to be a strong one and a successful one. So the relationship continued. That was 1776. Fast forward to 1782, and Sigmund Hofner himself becomes official. He's becoming a noble. There's a celebration and a ceremony surrounding that event. And he turned once again to his friend Mozart to write something more. Mozart was already famous at this point. And it's also important to note that he was toward the end of his career. The piece of music that Mozart wrote in honor of Sigmund Hofner's rise to fame, so to speak, was what we now call the Hofner Symphony, his 35th symphony. Mozart, of course, only made it to 41 symphonies. So when you listen to this symphony and you consider its place on the timeline, you really have to understand that there have already been so many evolutions in Mozart's approach to symphonic writing. If you go to those early symphonies, few of them have very many woodwinds at all, often just oboes and bassoons with horns and strings. But by the time it was time for him to write this 35th symphony, his orchestra, his mental image, his sonic image of the orchestra had grown. You have not only one flute, but multiple flutes, which wouldn't be normal, wouldn't be a regular part of the orchestra for many more years. Even Beethoven himself often only used one flute in many of his works, especially the concertos. We have the integration of clarinets, which offers a new sound and a new color to the orchestra. And it really just shows us exactly what Mozart was capable of as a composer. Just similar to the Hofner Serenade, his 35th symphony has much of that fresh, young and energetic attitude and spirit, and also is a bit of a challenge still to this day. As I'll make a personal note, as a bassoonist, the Hofner Symphony is one that we practice over and over and over again, especially the last movement, because of the technique it requires, the tonguing of the fast motion, not only from the bassoons, but from much of the orchestra. So we're going to listen to a little bit of the opening of the fourth movement of Mozart's 35th Symphony, his Hofner Symphony, written in honor of Sigmund Hofner and his rise to fame, his official noblemanship back in 1782. So throughout that symphony, you not only hear the spirit of celebration and Mozart's genius use of orchestration, you also hear a bit of his personality, how he didn't take things too seriously. In that final movement there, in that excerpt that we listened to, it starts very quiet, and then out of nowhere you have the bassoons and the strings. So the play between the loud and soft, the rhythmic, the speed of the rhythms, how that interplays with each other, just offers a really fun experience, and an experience everyone back in 1782 enjoyed, the Hofner family, and one that audiences have continued to enjoy after all of these over 200 years, an experience that I'm sure you and everyone attending the concert on August 18th will appreciate as well. So as you listen to the performance, the full performance of Mozart's 35th Symphony, his Hofner Symphony, I hope you'll think about all of these things, the way in which his relationship with the Hofners was very important, how it was important to celebrate them and to also show his own personality, things that we'll see in the other pieces on this concert as well. So creating and celebrating, again, classical music, or that classical era of music. Mozart and Haydn, who's pictured there, Franz Joseph Haydn, their relationship isn't very well documented, but through the documents that we do have, we know that they knew each other and that they were inspired by one another. Many people, many historians will tell you that Haydn was actually the more famous composer than Mozart during his day, but despite that, they were both they played vital roles in the codification of that classical era sound, that sound that we think about when we think about the music of Haydn and Mozart and so many other of the composers at that time. Well, toward the beginning of the 20th century, that love and appreciation for that sound still hadn't gone away. And the composer pictured on the screen there next to Mozart and Haydn, Sergei Prokofiev, he appreciated that sound as well. And he wanted to write a piece of music that honored that. He was still a student when he came up with this idea, so the resulting composition was his very first symphony. It's even dubbed the Classical Symphony. It's important to note that around this time in the early 20th century, you had folks like Stravinsky and so many others writing in a style that we know today as neoclassical, using those structures and frames built by Mozart and Haydn to create new music. Well, Prokofiev didn't really appreciate his first symphony being put into that box. He considered neoclassical music Bach with the wrong notes as it's been written. So we definitely do not consider this piece by Prokofiev a neoclassical work, but one that rather celebrates the aesthetics of that classical era. His first symphony, better known as the Classical Symphony. So as we will explore through this concert and through this presentation, we have to consider the fact, was Prokofiev celebrating this aesthetic, or was he appropriating the aesthetic? He wrote this as a celebration and not as a piece of music that he's claiming to have invented something new, but one where he was very open with his appreciation of Haydn and Mozart in writing it. So I think this is a really great example of how one composer can celebrate a culture, celebrate an aesthetic without appropriating it. That's my opinion anyway. We'll listen to a little bit of the final movement of Prokofiev's first symphony, his Classical Symphony, and I'll let you decide if this is celebration or appropriation. Yeah, I chose that excerpt from the Classical Symphony because it reminds me so much of that final movement of Mozart's Hofner Symphony. So once again, we have different use of rhythm, fast rhythm versus slow rhythm. We have dynamics that quickly go from soft to not so soft, and just that general cheerful, youthful aesthetic that I believe Prokofiev really paid attention to when he was writing that music. Much of his study was centered around the string quartets of Haydn, but as you could hear there's no denying the similarities between the symphonic sound of Mozart and the symphonic sound of Prokofiev's celebrating that classical aesthetic. One thing to note is that in the music of Mozart, bassoons specifically were grouped more in the family of those low strings. So those fast moving bassoon lines that you heard in the final movement of the Hofner Symphony don't particularly exist in the final movement of the classical symphony of Prokofiev. But again, that aesthetic is still maintained, and it's a really incredible piece, one that's been celebrated for a little over 100 years now since its original composition back when Sergei Prokofiev was a student. It's also important to note that the sound of Russian music, thanks to folks like the Mighty Handful, that group of composers was well established. So no one listening to this piece then would have ever confused this for something Russian. So once again, another example of how Prokofiev wasn't appropriating the sound, but really celebrating the sound through his own work. So the tradition, the exercise of looking back is one that composers have never let go of all the way to today. Pictured here is another composer who's featured on the August 18th concert, Steve Reich. He's quoted as saying, "I'm interested in perceptible processes. I want to be able to hear the process happening throughout the sounding music." So he's known as a minimalist composer, a style that came about in the 50s and 60s. Steve Reich and others were at the head of it. And when he talks about being interested in perceptible processes, what I hear from that quote, I think is easily heard in his music. He wants people to understand what he's drawing from and the actual blueprint of the composition itself. He goes on to say his music is built around simple unison canons between the two violins. This is in reference to the duet that's on this concert, who from time to time slightly vary the rhythmic distance between their two voices. So this might be something that is a little heady just in words, but I thought I would bring in a couple musical examples to make this a little clearer. So in his duet for two violins and strings, he notes the rhythmic relationship between the two soloists. And this goes all the way back to the days of Bach, even before Mozart and Haydn. This idea of two soloists sort of replicating each other rhythmically and sonically has always been an idea. So we're going to listen to an example first, actually, from Bach's catalog when it comes to this relationship between two soloists and hearing the process laying out while being able to really note the relationship between the two music. You'll see how one soloist starts and the next soloist plays something very similar to the first soloist in a sort of canon form. So this is an excerpt from Bach. So pay attention to the solo violin now and the second violin that comes in later. So it's sort of like a call and response. And as we saw in the latter part of that excerpt, Bach's Concerto for Two Violins, by the way, sometimes the second violin even takes the lead and the first violin comes back in that canonic form, playing exactly what the previous violin soloist had played. So when you really condense that, we have about 8 bars between the entrance of one soloist and the next in the in that excerpt we just heard. When you listen to the duet for two violins and strings by Reich, you can notice the same thing. You can hear the same thing, but it's much closer. So in the excerpt we're about to hear, the two violin soloists are separated by only about a beat. So if you listen very carefully, you can hear the same technique, just in a much more contemporary fashion. It's the Minnesota Orchestra, by the way. Yeah, so as I was listening there, I think I counted 2 beats between the 2 melodies, the way that they fit on top of one another. As you can hear, the sound between the Bach and the Reich are very different. The general aesthetic is quite different, but many of the techniques are quite the same. When it comes to the question of celebration or appropriation, this is another example of where I think we really have to cite celebration and not appropriation. Steve Reich does a great job of noting how this technique plays a role in his piece of in his music in general, certainly this piece of music, where he got it from and how he can make it new, refresh that idea. It's a really nice piece to listen to aesthetically. You can just sit back, close your eyes if you want to, and enjoy everything that washes over you, or you can just listen to every little note, every little entrance, and think about the relationship between the soloists as it applied to Bach way back when, and as that applies to Steve Reich today. So for many reasons, a really incredible piece of music to listen to, and one that I know that you will enjoy on August 18th. Now, Steve Reich is not without his own controversy when it comes to the subject of celebration or appropriation. About a year or so ago, a woman named Valerie Wilmer caught the news for an excerpt that came from a book called A Hidden Landscape Once a Week. So in this excerpt, she cites meeting with Steve Reich and how he visited Africa and incorporated those sounds into his music, and would turn around and say things that weren't so great about those people. This really caught the news. It pulled into question again this idea of appropriation and what that means musically, what that means specifically in Western classical music. And while it wasn't the greatest of times for Steve Reich, it was definitely a moment of learning, not only for Reich himself, but the entire musical ecosystem. Now, he did not just let it wash over. He definitely came to terms with this in a work written by Jacob Rosenberg, How Steve Reich Made Music Out of White Complicity. He notes that he is confronting white listeners. Your calm is built on a violence done to someone else. Either the violence becomes a monotone drone, or you were never really listening at all. This is in response to a work by Steve Reich that honors folks known today as the Harlem Six. So a piece of music and a story written about a bit of racial injustice back in the 50s or 60s, I believe. So it's a conversation that has been engaged broadly, and a conversation that Steve Reich himself has engaged. So as you listen to his duet for two violins and strings, and think about the relationship that those techniques have with the age-old music of Bach, I hope you'll also think about the fact that this is a conversation that Steve Reich has had to deal with head on, and plays a role in his music that he's been writing in the past couple of years. A very important conversation, and something important to note about the legacy and the work of Steve Reich. His fall from grace, so to speak. I hate to use that phrase, but his fall from grace, his understanding the issue, and his coming back up, having learned something and being able to display that to the broader music community. The same thing applies. There's a similar story when it comes to the music of Caroline Shaw, when that's also on this program, music by Caroline Shaw. But before we talk about Caroline Shaw, we have to talk about the woman who's pictured here. Her name is Tanya Tagaq. So one of the things that really got Caroline Shaw on the map for a lot of people was her winning the Pulitzer Prize at age 30 for a piece of music called the Partita for 8 Voices. It incorporates all sorts of vocal techniques that display the abilities of the ensemble Room Full of Teeth. But when it got out to the world, there were indigenous communities who really found offense. And one of the more outspoken people in that regard, again, was Tanya Tagaq. On that piece of music, the Partita for 8 Voices, she's quoted as saying, "This is appropriation. No Inuit are named as composers, no Inuit hired. At least credit the Inuit who taught you as composers, so they too can benefit and book more gigs to put food on the table. Taking from poor brown people and siphoning it into white throats and profiteering is wrong." I know that these can come off as strong words, but Tanya Tagaq really identified her own culture when this piece of music won the Pulitzer Prize, and was not able to identify the inspirations. Again, we talked about Mozart celebrating the Hofners. We talked about Prokofiev celebrating Haydn and Mozart, even in name and not only technique. This did not happen in relation to Caroline Shaw's Partita for 8 Voices, and it also initiated a very important musical conversation. So just to give you an idea of what Tanya Tagaq was talking about specifically, I chose 2 excerpts here. The first thing we're going to do is listen to Tanya Tagaq explain the ideas and the techniques around something called throat singing, or Inuit throat singing.
Examples like, it's a song that you give the deep part on the exhalation and then a high note on the inhalation, like so when you're inhaling, you teach your throat how to make a noise. There's other noises that are exhaling for everything, and it's a little more difficult because you have to learn how to splice the notes, going from high to low in one time. So you're making a noise like high up with your normal talking voice and in your nasal cavity, and then dropping it really quickly into your epiglottis.
So that very recognizable, that very unique vocal technique was recognized by Inuit communities, including Tanya Tagaq, in one movement of the Partita for 8 Voices by Caroline Shaw. So we'll listen to a little bit of that now.
Examples like, it's a song that...
Here it is. So as the story grew, so did the question. Is this an example of celebration or an example of appropriation? Tanya Tagaq unapologetically noted this as appropriation, and Caroline Shaw herself responded in agreement. Caroline Shaw, in a very long Twitter thread, as well as other official statements, reiterated the point that Tanya Tagaq was making, and really honored the point that Tanya was making by doing many different things, taking on several different initiatives, including offering resources to Inuit communities, and really giving Tanya Tagaq her flowers for calling out this issue and making sure that it's an issue that other folks understood, not as a point of tearing down Caroline Shaw, but again, just like with the Steve Reich situation, as a point of learning for both composer, performers, and everyone who is meant to enjoy this music. So if you're on Twitter and you follow Caroline Shaw, you can dig through and find that entire conversation, a very important conversation to engage. So why is that story important? Why is all of this important? It's important, in my opinion, because when we talk about the piece of music by Caroline Shaw that is on this program, Watermark, we have to think about its connections to the past. After dealing with this situation, I know that Caroline Shaw's approach to celebrating and honoring other composers has changed forever. Among the people who were involved with the commissioning of the Watermark Piano Concerto was the pianist Jonathan Biss. He's quoted here as saying, "One of the central tasks for any musician, whether composer or performer, is to come to terms with Beethoven. What this means is that any serious composer will have plenty to say on the subject of Beethoven. That is why the idea of asking composers to write a piece that in some way responds to Beethoven excited me." So Jonathan Biss, when asked to take on this project, he went on and contacted, I believe, 5 different composers to write their specific response to Beethoven. And the Watermark Piano Concerto was Caroline Shaw's example. In writing that piece of music, Caroline Shaw says that she used the music of Beethoven, specifically his 3rd piano concerto, as inspiration. So just as we have with a couple of the other works on this program, we're going to listen to a little bit of Beethoven's 3rd piano concerto, about a minute of that, note some of the techniques there, and hear how Caroline Shaw applied that to her piano concerto written many years later. So here's an excerpt from Beethoven's 3rd piano concerto. This performance features the Vienna Philharmonic. The piano soloist is Christian Zimmermann. So the important things that I want you to remember as we listen to an excerpt here from Caroline Shaw's Watermark is not only the general aesthetic, that C minor aesthetic, but the rhythm, that bum, 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 or the bum, 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 bum. You'll hear it here in an excerpt from Caroline Shaw's Watermark. This performance features the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra with Jonathan Biss himself at the keys. So as you can hear, they're very similar aesthetics that are that can't be denied when it comes to the connection to Beethoven. In the program notes, you can read that Caroline Shaw says herself that it wasn't her intention to replicate the sound of Beethoven, but to honor it. So both through that C minor aesthetic that we most famously see in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, the use of orchestra and piano as collaborative forces, maybe not so much embedded within each other, but being in conversation. I think this is a really great example of not appropriation, but celebration. Caroline Shaw, with her contemporary aesthetics and contemporary perspectives on Western classical music, honoring something quite plainly, quite obviously, music that took place so long ago. So despite the situation with her partita for 8 voices and of the critiques that she got from Tanya Tagaq and many others, Caroline Shaw has responded, has learned, and not only responded in words, but even in music. I think this is a really phenomenal example of how Caroline Shaw really has an understanding of that classical early romantic era of Western classical music, and her ability to celebrate that. When this is performed on the 18th, I hope you'll think about that. Think about that connection between Beethoven and Shaw. Think about, again, that tonality, that seriousness of C minor, as opposed to the playfulness of the Beethoven and Prokofiev compositions, and just how that aesthetic that Beethoven set forth so long ago in the early 1800s is still alive today, even in contemporary music. It's easy to put contemporary music into a box of works that are scary, challenging, or hard to listen to, but this is definitely not an example of that. It's both an example of celebration, not appropriation, and a great example of how contemporary music can really speak to age-old aesthetics in a new and refreshed way. So what's the moral of the story? Well, how does all of this tie up? Well, I picked a quote from Igor Stravinsky, a neo-classical composer, as I mentioned earlier. He famously said, "Good musicians borrow, great musicians steal." So that is something to consider when we think about the idea of celebration versus appropriation. Outside inspiration, as we see in this concert program, is a part of the Western classical tradition. Whether it's Mozart celebrating people, Prokofiev celebrating Haydn or Mozart, Steve Reich celebrating the aesthetics and the techniques specifically of Bach, and Caroline Shaw celebrating the general aesthetics of Beethoven. It's just really a part of what this tradition is. Honoring the subjects of inspiration is a part of the Western classical tradition, as well. Mozart did it all the way in the title of his 35th symphony. It's called the Hofner Symphony, so there's no denying where that inspiration comes from. Even in the aesthetics alone of the Prokofiev Symphony and the Caroline Shaw piano concerto, that composition, aesthetically, you can hear those inspirations named. The music isn't separate from the world, nor its responses to the art. It was very political for Mozart to write a piece of music for the Hofners. We have to consider that today. Music, even classical music, Western classical music, cannot and should not be a means of ignoring or closing ourselves off from the world, but really acknowledging the world and learning more about the world. I'm not sure that I would know about the birth of Sigmund Hofner in 1756 if it weren't for music. So just one example of how we can't separate the music from the time, from the world, and how it can even be used as a means of learning about the world. Celebration without appropriation is fully possible and fully necessary. Steve Reich and Caroline Shaw definitely stepped in holes, so to speak, throughout their compositional career and the examples that I've named, but we've also seen how they are able to celebrate without appropriating, something that I hope that we will all think about in all terms and all aspects of our lives. Culture is not a costume. Everything has an origin worth investigating, not only for the sake of what is being produced, but for the sake of the actual people from which that culture and those conversations came from, and as a point of education and learning for the folks consuming that art. So that's the end of this presentation. I really appreciate everyone coming in this morning. If there are any questions or comments, I encourage you to leave those in the chat here, and I will address those. As I'm waiting for a couple of those comments, I'll just go back again to the program. This program, as it's published on the Lakes Area Music Festival website, the concert order will be the duet for two solo violins and strings by Steve Reich, the Hofner Symphony, Symphony number 35 in D major by Mozart, Caroline Shaw's Watermark, piano concerto featuring the one and only Tanya Gabrielian, and the concert will conclude with Sergei Prokofiev's very first symphony, known as his Classical Symphony. Again, a really incredible program that ties together beautifully and is a great jumping off point for lots of conversation. When you hear these pieces of music in their full length, in their entirety, I know that there will be many more examples that you may be able to pinpoint, especially in the Steve Reich, when it comes to the relationship between the counterpuntal, if I can use one of those big music words, the counterpuntal relationship between Reich's work and Bach's work and everything in between. A really incredible program. I'll give it just a few more minutes to get any questions or comments from you. Again, while we're waiting, I'll note another thing that I'll note about the Hofner Symphony, that Symphony number 35, is that in addition to having that really bright and cheerful tone about it, I think it also lends an ear to what would come next in Beethoven's catalog. I mentioned that he included, a full body, certainly back then, a full body of winds in that composition. That's a trend that Mozart would hang on to for his next 6 symphonies, all the way up to his 41st symphony before he passed away in the year of 1791. When we think about Prokofiev's Classical Symphony in relation to that, I also think about the fact that Haydn wrote 104 symphonies of very similar structure and technique. So in preparation for this concert, as you're driving up to the concert hall, take a listen to one of those Haydn symphonies as well, just to prepare your ear for the general aesthetics that you're going to enjoy. Like the Hofner Symphony, many of those Haydn symphonies get several nicknames. I know there's the Queen Symphony, the Drum Roll Symphony, the Bears Symphony. I believe there's maybe not a fireworks symphony, but there's the Farewell Symphony. So any one of those. I have a question here. What are some ways audiences can recognize appropriation? I think that's a really good question. Well, I think the first step is when we hear things to really have the body of knowledge, have the life experience to recognize a sound that might be familiar. So again, in the excerpt from Tanya Gabrielian's, from Caroline Shaw's Watermark, in that excerpt, we heard Jonathan Biss playing bum, 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 bum. So being the musician I am, I hear that key of C minor. I hear that rhythm that reminds me of bum, 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 bum. And I can understand that, oh, maybe they are referring to something here. I think that will be one of the more obvious examples. As far as recognizing appropriation, I think it's just important to always have I hate to use the word a critical look, not that we should always be critics, but when we're hearing things or we're looking at pieces of art, looking at someone's Halloween costume, taking a look at TV, just really understanding what they're going for, what are the sources of the aesthetic that's being put forward, and understanding, is this something that was created by the person putting this forward, or are they celebrating something, or are they claiming it as their own? It's not an easy conversation. It's not an easy thing at all to traverse, and it can often get pretty sticky. But I think the real responsibility lies on the creator of the art. If you're doing something, if you're writing a piece of music, I've mentioned Halloween costumes because this conversation always comes up around that time of year. Whenever you're engaging anything in any sort of artful way, just think about where those ideas came from. Are they originally yours? Did you see something on TV or hear something that inspired it? And if you still want to celebrate it, figure out a way that you can make your audience, make sure that they know that you are recognizing where this comes from, and this is your means of celebration, just in the same way that Prokofiev did, and in the same way that Caroline Shaw does in that piano concerto, just making sure that the audience really understands that they know that this comes from somewhere, because there will always be someone in the crowd that knows that it all comes from somewhere. As I mentioned earlier, everything has an origin. So we have to make sure that we're investigating and celebrating those things if we mean to infuse them into our own projects, into our own bodies of art. I hope that answers the question. I know that it can, again, be sort of a shaky conversation, appropriation and celebration. I really do think it's on a case-by-case basis, and we can all do our part by, again, when we're putting out some sort of art, some sort of culture, recognizing where it comes from if it's not something original, and making sure that your audience or your intended audience understands what those origins are, again, for the sake of those people from which the culture is pulled, and for the sake of your audience learning and understanding and doing their own research and digging into the topic if that's something they're interested in. I know when the story of Tanya Tagaq and Caroline Shaw came out, I took it upon myself to learn everything I could about Inuit throat singing, just so that if it happens again, if I hear something else with that general aesthetic, I'm able to recognize it, not as a point of wagging a finger at a performer or a composer, as much as it's understanding where they're coming from and being on the same page of their celebration, my being able to recognize that celebration. Well, if those are all the questions, I will go ahead and begin to wrap up again. Oh, let's see. There's one more. Culture is not a costume. What a powerful and thought-provoking message. Yeah, just always think about that, especially when it comes to things like hair. You know, people consider my view on things a little extra progressive or extra forward oftentimes, but the next time, for example, you want to dress up as someone from the 70s and wear an Afro wig, you know, just think about if you can grow an Afro, if that's a hairstyle that you're able to do on your own. Not that it's necessarily bad to wear an Afro wig at Halloween or at your next 70s party, but it offers something to really think about, to really center when we're having these conversations. Not always easy conversations, but necessary conversations, and conversations, as we've seen in this presentation, that have direct connections to Western classical music. So thank you once again, everyone, for being here. This concert, Watermark, is taking place on Wednesday, August 18th at 7:30 p.m. You can learn more information about it and all of the other concerts on the summer series at lakesareamusic.org. You can also, as I spoke to last week, support the Lakes Area Music Festival on the website. On the front page of the website, just go to the top, click the support button, and make a decision how you want to contribute to this work to make sure that these concerts and all of these presentations can continue to be a part of everything that Scott and Taylor and everyone up at Lakes Area is doing. So thanks again for being here. I hope you enjoy the concert on August 18th, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.